Hi everyone, welcome to our continuation of our lecture for learning from others and reviewing the literature for chapter 3. This is Sir Marlo Salido and I will be discussing to you the conceptual framework. So we already have an idea on what conceptual framework is, right? I believe that when you were in grade 11, you were able to do this already. So this time, it's just more of a refresher and probably giving you some ideas and insights on how to make an effective conceptual framework. Let's talk about the definition of a conceptual framework. A conceptual framework is defined as an analytical tool that explains the main concepts to be studied or investigated in one's research. The second definition that we have here actually talks about mainly what a conceptual framework is. It is a visual or graphic form of the problem statement in order to effectively visualize the different variables of the study and the presumed relationship among these variables. The keywords here are the following: visual or graphic form, problem statement, and relationship. The beauty of having conceptual framework is that at the first glance, it would just be easy for your readers on what you're particularly studying. Through the drawing that you have or through the graphical representation that you have in your research, it would clearly state the relationship between two or more variables in your study. And lastly, the literature review of the study is the logical basis of the conceptual framework. Why is it that literature review is considered to be the logical basis of the conceptual framework? We know that it's possible to craft a conceptual framework with just the research problem and the research questions. However, the beauty of having literature review is that it really gives you a concrete, more credible reasons why you're having that relationship interfering the other variable. Okay, so that makes literature review as the best and the most credible source of conceptual framework. These are the advantages of having conceptual framework. Number one, it offers the rationale and fundamental basis of the entire research. Second, it presents the interrelationships of theories, principles, and beliefs that are essential to the investigation of the problem. And third, it specifies what will and will not be studied. The beauty of having conceptual framework is that the researcher and the readers as well will have a clear understanding of what is being done or what is being studied in this particular research. What are the variables involved? In just a simple glance, it would just be easy for us to really understand what we're fighting for. So now, I will be presenting to you the different models that are being used or the usual models that are being used when crafting or creating your conceptual framework. The first thing that we have here is the IVDV model. For sure, you're all familiar with this particular model because it is usually the model that you use when crafting your conceptual framework. We should know this fact that arrows in a conceptual framework symbolize something. Okay, so you don't just simply place arrows because you like that arrow. No, there's a story behind why we're using that particular arrow on that conceptual framework. In this case, IVDV model, again, this is the most common model that we're using because from the name itself, IV and DV, we're trying our best to see how the independent variable affects the dependent variable, right? So if you're conducting an experimental-based study, this is the perfect model for you. And kindly use this arrow, particularly that you see on the screen, because that depicts a cause and effect relationship, okay? So the moment you're using that arrow, you are trying to tell us that your dependent variable depends or was affected by your independent variable, or your independent variable affects your dependent variable. All right. The next model that we will be talking about is the predictor criterion model. When we talk about predictor criterion model, this is used when relating or assessing the influence between two or more variables. So earlier, we talked about the IVDV model. This time, predictor criterion is almost similar to the concept of IVDV. Predictor in this case is the IV, criterion is the outcome or the DV. However, there's a difference between the two, which we will later on discuss. Okay? So now, you might be asking, sir, when is the right time that we'll be using predictor criterion model over the IVDV model? There are three things that we should consider. Number one is the type of study that you will be conducting. Second is the manipulation of variable. Third is the line that you will be using to connect your first variable to your second variable. Let's go with the first one, the type of research that you will be conducting. In any case that you will be conducting an experimental research, then the best tool or best model that you will be using is the IVDD model. However, when your research is non-experimental, it's just descriptive, statistical, then predictor criterion model is the best method or the best model to be used. Second one is the manipulation of variable. We know that in IVDV model, there is a manipulation of variable that is taking place, right? We are manipulating the independent variable and we see how the dependent variable reacts to the manipulated variable. Okay, so that is experimental in nature. There is a manipulation of variable. However, in predictor criterion model, we do not promote any manipulation. Basically, your first variable or your predictor variable and your criterion variable are independent with each other. It's just a matter of finding the relationship between your predictor variable and your criterion variable. We are not controlling anything here, okay? Unlike in experimental, we don't control the dependent variable, but we control the independent variable. Just remember that and you're good to go. Now, since we're talking about relationship, okay, let's now talk about the third distinct feature of the two models, the IVDV model and the predictor criterion model. In the IVDV model, what you observe is that we use an arrow to connect one variable and another variable because that arrow signifies a cause and effect relationship that an independent variable affects your dependent variable. On the other hand, in the predictor criterion model, what you see on the screen is a solid line that connects your predictor variable and your criterion variable. So the moment you have two independent variables, let's say, or two variables that do not depend with each other and you're just looking for the relationship of these two variables, then you just simply use the block solid line. One best example of predictor criterion model would be a study on relationship status and academic performance. So as you can see, we don't really manipulate variables here because being in a relationship or being single is given. And your academic performance is also given. You don't really do experimental here. However, what you're only doing is collecting data who are single, who are in a relationship, and we also get their data whether their academic performance is good or not. Then frequency counts, and then we will see whether there's a relationship between being in a relationship or being single in terms of their academic performance. So that is predictor criterion model. You don't manipulate any variable. You just collect the data from one variable and then another data for another variable and try to see the correlation between these two variables. So that is predictor criterion model. Lastly, the common model that I always found on YouTube is the IPO or the input processing output model. This is largely used to isolate the factor or major variable that causes the problem or phenomenon under investigation. So the first box that you could see there is the input. The second one is the processing, and the third one is the output. What you actually write in the input box would be the characteristics, okay, of the target respondents that you are having for your research. In the processing output, it's about the methodology that you will be using for you to conduct or for you to get data from your input or for the characteristics, okay, of your target respondents. Let's say you will be conducting interviews, focus group discussions, surveys, etc. So that will be placed in the processing box. In the output box, this is what you are aiming. So what's the final answer that you really wanted on your research? Okay, what are you trying to prove here? So that is something that you put in the output model. So on the next slides, I'll be showing you some examples of the IPO or the input processing output. And lastly, there is this what we call the POM model, proposed original model. So it is used when the researcher presents an original paradigm. It's okay for you to create your own, especially if you have enough time to really create your own model for your conceptual framework. However, the first three models that we talked about, those are some samples that you could already work on, okay? So it's up to you whether you get inspiration from the three models that I presented or probably create your own model for your conceptual framework. So what you see on the screen is an example of an experimental type of conceptual framework. Probably this type of model is trying to study the effect of a particular drug to a certain group of people who have this particular disease. So, like for example, in diabetes, we have insulin, right? Insulin is a typical medication for people who have diabetes. And let's say there is a revolutionary discovery of a product or of a drug. So this model is the best model to be used when you have that particular research study. You're proving the effect of that newly discovered drug to the people who have diabetes. So you have randomly selected experimental group. You have two groups here. You have randomly selected experimental group and randomly selected control group. When you talk about randomly selected control group, these are the population or sample, let's say. These are the sample that undergo the normal or ordinary treatment. However, when we have the randomly selected experimental group, they're the ones who will be undergoing the new treatment. So that's the reason why the treatment at the center is just on the randomly selected experimental group, because the randomly selected control group does not have any treatment at all because they will be undergoing their regular treatment, okay? So you have your post-test at the end because you wanted to see the difference, okay, from the pre-test and the post-test, and same goes with the pre-test and post-test. And now you're trying to prove whether the treatment is better than the insulin or the ordinary treatment. So this is the good model that you can use for your research, especially for experimental. This is also a similar example from the previous slide. It almost applies the IPO model, the input, the processing, and the output. Next example that we have here is a research study that uses a predictor criterion model. So the predictor variable here would be the students with GPA of 90 above. When you talk about GPA, this is the general point average. And we have two criterion variables. These are two separate, okay, individual variables. Level of social conformity and also the level of obedience. So in this case, it is not an IVDV model because we already have three exclusive variables in this case. Students with GPA of 90 above, it's something that we cannot control. Technically, their grades are already given, okay? Their level of social conformity and level of obedience, it's a DV, it's a dependent variable that we want to know whether the moment you have a high GPA, it means you will also be having a high level of social conformity, and same goes with the level of obedience. So they will be getting a test, okay, to check their level of social conformity and level of obedience, but it's something that we cannot control, okay? It's still their answer towards that survey that would give us a result on their level of social conformity and level of obedience. And we'll be looking at the relationship of these variables, whether having a very high grade would lead to a high level of social conformity or not. So it only creates a relationship with one variable and another variable. It doesn't mean that we promote cause and effect relationship for the two variables. Okay? Alright, so that's the end of my presentation for conceptual framework. I do hope that you get to have an understanding already of the different models that we can use, the IVDB model, the predictor criterion model, the IPO model. You know, you can use these models to craft your own conceptual framework. Again, the basis of our conceptual framework would be on our review of related literature. So kindly do your related literature seriously because it could really affect how you would craft your conceptual framework. So that's it for today. Thank you very much, students, and have a great day.